أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح.
ارجع عليه.
Cantar que vamos a triunfar, avanzan ya banderas de unidad y tú vendrás marchando junto a mí y así verás tu canto y tu bandera florecer.
Hello and welcome everybody to NATO versus Peace, a short course on US imperialism and the war in Ukraine. My name is Layan and I am with the International People's Assembly. Before we start, I just want to give a few orientations for how to participate virtually in this course. First of all, this course is being interpreted into 5 different languages. It's available on the Zoom application by clicking on the globe icon and selecting your language. And available on the IPA International People's Assembly YouTube page in all 5 languages as well. To avoid any accidental interruptions, all microphones will be muted for the duration of the session. So for those of you who are on Zoom, we do encourage you to make all of your comments and questions in the chat, and we will be collecting them there. Some questions will be selected after the presenters have spoken, so please feel free to post any question at any time. A reminder that this class is being live streamed, and so you can revisit this recording on the International People's Assembly YouTube page at a later time if you would like. So once again, welcome to this course. This is the final session in our 3-part series for this course on US imperialism and the war in Ukraine. It has been organized by the International People's Assembly, or the IPA. The IPA is a global network of people's movements, parties, and organizations committed to the struggle against capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, and racism. And the goal of this course has been to present some of the very important historical facts and information that are relevant to the current war in Ukraine and that can help us understand what this war means for all people who are in struggle against imperialism across the world. In the past 2 sessions, we discussed the history and the current agenda of NATO, and also the role and consequences of sanctions in today's current context. We will share the links to both of these classes in case you had to miss these sessions. Today, we want to look towards the future. The past decades have been characterized by nonstop and relentless war across the world. So today we want to ask the question, how can we have a world without war? What are the conditions necessary for us to live in a situation of peace? And how can we understand what peace means in this context of active imperialist aggression across the globe? For this, we are very honored to have with us 2 wonderful speakers. Ben Becker, joining us from New York, who is a member of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and he is a longtime organizer in the anti-war movement. He has edited several books, including Imperialism in the 21st Century, Updating Lenin's Theory a Century Later, and he holds a doctorate in US history from the University of New York. And we also want to welcome Dr. Akid Takez, the coordinator of the World Peace Council in the Middle East region, secretary of the Palestine Committee for Peace and Solidarity, and a member of the Palestinian People's Party. Welcome to both of our speakers. We will begin with comments from Ben, and then we will hear from Dr. Akid. So please remember that you can put any of your questions in the chat, and I would like to welcome Ben.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you to everyone who's joined today on Zoom and on the different media platforms. Our subject today is conditions for peace, and it's the 3rd part of a class series for those who haven't seen the initial ones, where we've gone through some of the history that brought us to the present moment, which is obviously a moment where war is dominating every headline in every newspaper really around the world. You know, even though Leanne said we're going to look to the future, the truth is that there's only so much we can look to the future without becoming kind of, you know, we're not fortune tellers. We don't have a crystal ball where we can see the future. And of course, I could sort of paint a picture of a utopia where everyone lives in peace and harmony. And that would be a nice picture. But the main question, of course, would still be, well, how do we get there? And I think for any person who's an organizer, an activist, a militant, you know, we're always thinking about how do we go from here to there? So it wouldn't be appropriate to just simply paint a picture of a future idealistic world, but to really have us understand and deepen our understanding of the current world so as to understand what needs to change so that there can be peace. It's actually almost impossible to even imagine peace for someone who's been living in this world. I was thinking about it this morning when I woke up, and I watched some of the initial videos too, from the first 2 classes. As Vijay Prashad said in the first class, just reminding us of some of the data we may have learned before. The United States has over 800 military bases around the world. It's spending $1 trillion per year on this military machine. I mean, that is an incredible amount of money. Just to put in perspective the amount of money, if you spend $1,000 a day for 3,000 years, you know, that's going back to before the birth of Jesus Christ. Sorry, if you spend $1,000 a day for 3 years, you're going to spend $1 million. So that's like a millionaire. But if you spend $1,000 a day for 3,000 years, you know, then you're going to spend $1 billion. But spending $1,000 a day for 3 million years, that's how much it would cost to spend $1 trillion. And that's what the United States is spending every single year on this military machine. It's larger than the next 10 countries' military budgets combined. So with this kind of apparatus being developed, you have to ask the question, how can we possibly have peace? And I think this is the fundamental question, is that this world order will not produce peace, that we need a fundamentally different world order that doesn't have this kind of military spending and the US military supremacy at the very center of it. Both of my parents are anti-war activists, in addition to being, leftists. And I think about my whole life, I'm 38, my whole life has been going to anti-war demonstrations. When I think about when I was 6 years old, it was the invasion of Panama, 1989. And then I just think about the years after, and it's just been war after war after war. There was Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, the Sahel region, Iraq again, Libya, Syria, Yemen. It's war after war after war. Every year, it's almost impossible to consider how there could be a world without war. And that's putting aside the less direct forms of war. That's the funding of death squad governments in Colombia and Central America, the hybrid wars against Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, many other countries. Conflict, war, and a combination of tactics seems to be so permanently a feature of our world order. To really talk about peace, we have to think about how much that world order needs to change. And of course, the contradiction is that people want peace around the world. Working class people, most of all, want peace, because in every war, it's the working class that suffers the most, who get sent to kill and die, who are the victims of non-discriminate bombing, who are referred to as collateral damage. I mean, all people of conscience have to shudder at this concept that human beings could be just collateral damage. Every person who looks at an image of a war has to be feeling great feelings of revulsion and horror when you see a child who's been killed and you think of your child. When you see an elderly person who's been killed they've done nothing wrong, and you think of your grandparents. This sort of yearning for peace, I think, is intrinsic to the human condition, especially for people who who get nothing from war, who just want peace because they want to have time with their families, who want to be left alone, who want to have prosperity. So the great contradiction is we have a species that I would say on the whole desires peace. And yet for the last 120 years in particular, it's been nothing but war after war after war. And the problem is that this desire for peace, which I believe is very widespread, can be manipulated. And it's been manipulated, in fact, by the greatest war makers the world has ever seen. Let me give you an example. Right now in the United States, for the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've heard nothing but advocacy for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. At first, the people of the United States were not very interested in a no-fly zone, according to the polls. They said, this is, a situation that's happening far away. Why would we get deeper involved? But after 5 or 6 weeks of just creating sensational outrage about the war in Ukraine, and of course, it's horrible to see the images of war, but to foment this feeling that we have to do something, we have to do something, we have to do something. In fact, the US media has been more militaristic than even the Biden administration. Every reporter every day gets up and asks the Biden administration, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you sending more weapons to end this conflict? Why aren't you introducing a no-fly zone? And after all of this constant sort of communication war, now a no-fly zone has become popular in the United States, according to US polls, because it sounds wonderful. A no-fly zone, meaning the planes that are dropping bombs will no longer fly. So the images of war will no longer be there. The suffering will be alleviated. But they haven't explained the most fundamental thing, that a no-fly zone requires shooting down Russian military planes. It means the US doing it. It means Russia and the US, the world's largest two nuclear powers, being in direct conflict with one another. So in fact, a no-fly zone, which is projected as a path to peace, is actually a path to World War III, and perhaps the greatest catastrophe the world has ever seen. But because the people don't understand the implications of what a no-fly zone is, it's their yearning for peace that is being manipulated. And a yearning for peace could actually be converted into a World War III. So that's really what I consider the great value of classes like this. It allows us to break out of the media cycle, the breaking news media cycle, where you're just being hit with an image and then a demand, let's do something to stop this. And if you get locked in that media cycle, you're unable to understand the deeper causes of the war. You're unable to understand who's a peacemaker and who's a war maker. You understand the situation only as Russia and Ukraine, not as the culmination or fruition of decades of tension that has been mounting, and really a conflict between an old world order that is now coming into conflict with a new world order. It's important for all people who want peace to understand that that peace is not just the absence of war. This is really fundamental. And I think it's important to distinguish when we say we want peace from simple pacifism. We've always said that peace and justice have to go together. There has to be peace with social justice. There has to be peace with national independence and sovereignty. To be living peacefully and suffering peacefully in poverty and hunger is not real peace. To be living peacefully under military occupation is not real peace. We're going to hear from our comrade and brother from Palestine soon. And of course, the Palestinian people themselves are the perfect demonstration of this, that there would be no great achievement of peace if the Palestinian people were to stop resisting, okay? If they were to peacefully submit to foreign occupation. So we've come to recognize, I would say, progressive people all over the world over decades, that there is such thing as self-defense, that there are such thing as just wars, wars against military occupation, wars for national liberation, wars against slavery, and so on. No one can look back at those wars and say, I wish there had been peace, because these were wars that ultimately advanced humanity, as terrible as they were. So I think we can be the greatest advocates for a peaceful world order, for peace, without lapsing into pacifism, which puts an equal sign between all forms of violence, that says that all violence is equally bad, that violence of any type is unjustified no matter what condition. That's ultimately a philosophy that the greatest perpetrators of war, like the Pentagon and NATO, will never observe themselves. So if we just inculcate our people, the oppressed, with notions of pacifism, it means basically that great violence will be visited upon them and they will do nothing in return. So these are complicated questions, the questions of war and peace, that really the whole international movement has been grappling with for the last 120 years, which again, as I say, has produced catastrophic war after catastrophic war. And I want to go through what we think in the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the book that was mentioned earlier. What are the main periods of war, the recent periods of imperialism and war, to help us try to envision a new period, a period without imperialism and without war. And the greatest contribution of Marxism and of Lenin in particular has been to demonstrate that capitalism and peace are impossible to reconcile, that capitalism as a global system inevitably produces war, that it is in fact a system that is addicted to war. And if we can't appreciate that and understand that, will always be chasing an illusory peace, a peace that's an illusion. We have to change the underlying economic system to achieve a lasting peace. So I want to go over what we've presented as sort of the three main periods of imperialism and war, and help us understand what could be a new period based on human solidarity, friendship between peoples, a genuine community of nations. You know, the United Nations uses the phrase community of nations, and yet that same institution has also been used to cover great war crimes and give legitimacy to US unilateral actions. So to have a genuine community of nations, I think, is something that we all should push for. In the early 20th century, Lenin wrote a book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In this pamphlet, a short pamphlet written in the middle of World War I, Lenin, the Russian revolutionary leader, was trying to explain how the world had come to war. And he made very clear observations, which I think many of us would, whether or not you're a Marxist, I think you would have to recognize this is true, that the competition between nation states for markets, for territories, trade routes, colonies, and so forth, inevitably produces conflicts between them. There was once a brief period in the late 1800s where people thought capitalism is so well developed that maybe there won't be war, that the era of wars between countries had been superseded by this new great capitalist system, that there would now be peaceful competition between the countries. But by the turn of the 20th century, many revolutionaries had begun to observe the great militarization of the different competing colonial powers who would come into conflict with one another over each other's colonies. It became clear that a new wave of wars was coming, and because of the advances in military technology, it would be the most catastrophic war humanity had ever seen. People knew that this was coming, and people said, we don't want war. The working class of France and Germany, Switzerland, England, they all signed declarations. All the great labor unions and working class parties said, if it comes to war, we have nothing to gain from it. We have more in common with the workers of other nations than we do with our own capitalist class. They said, we will fight to make sure that the war doesn't take place. But then when the war finally came, and this is a complicated history we can't get into, almost all of the countries, including their left wing, including their working class parties, caved to nationalism. And they actually signed up for the wars that they had said they would fight. That war left 40 million people dead, 40 million, almost all working class people. Instead of there being a just peace after that war, you know, a peace that would be the war to end all wars, just 2 decades later, another world war. 70 million dead in that world war. 70 million people died. This was, of course, not just an inter-imperialist war, because at this time the Soviet Union existed, but it demonstrated the tendency towards the division and redivision of the world based on capitalist markets, this desire for capitalist countries to expand, to conquer, to control new territories and trade routes. It demonstrated and validated once again that capitalism is a system that only can produce war upon war. We cannot forget the history of the 2 world wars as we think about the current situation in Ukraine, or as we think about peace. Because for all of the sanctimonious and frankly racist presentation that war is not something that happens in Europe, that war is something that happens in the global South, not the peace-loving European people. These countries of Europe produced the greatest bloodshed and human suffering ever seen in the world not so long ago in Europe. Each of these world wars, which were produced by the inevitable drive of capitalism towards war, also produced revolutions. people who said they want to get out of this capitalist world system. They have nothing to gain from it. And especially in the global South, the colonies began to break free from the great war makers and colonial masters. We, of course, can't go through this whole period, but I want to make one point and emphasize it. After World War II, the main capitalist country that was left standing was the United States. And the US foreign policy planners recognized essentially what Lenin had predicted 25 years ago. And that is that the big capitalist countries will inevitably keep going to war with one another unless something big changes. So they created a new world order. And they said, under this new world order, instead of punishing those countries that we had just defeated, Germany and Japan most of all, we're going to incorporate them under our control. We're going to give them space in this new world order to become rich. We are going to create a system based on international institutions like NATO, like the Bretton Woods financial institutions, new trade organizations, because they recognize that without these kind of new institutions, there would again be more wars between them, which destroy human life, infrastructure, and lead to revolution. So they said, instead of the capitalists fighting each other, what we need to do is unite. Capitalists of the world unite, they essentially proclaimed. And capitalists of the world unite now against socialism and against the anti-colonial movements. This is when Europe finally has a period of peace. Peace in Europe, so to speak. But peace at whose expense? Peace between the European capitalist countries, but now colonialism is converted into neocolonialism. Rather than literal wars between the colonial powers, they create a new system where they impose a trade, finance, and debt on the former colonies so as to essentially keep them colonized, but by a new name. And the wars, the great wars of this second period after World War II, instead of taking place in Europe, are taking place in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, in Central America, and so on. So this was not a period of peace. This was a new period of war, but a changed war. And the world order, rather than being multipolar between many different capitalist countries, is the capitalist world essentially versus the socialist and non-aligned world. A bipolar world is emerging. To skip ahead to the end of that world order, to skip ahead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 1991 and 92, when the Soviet Union is collapsing, many people again say, well, now we should have a peace dividend. If the whole world is now capitalist, shouldn't we be able to have peace? If the wars against socialism are over because the capitalists have won, will there not be peace? And many say this is a great time to wind down the US military spending, to say this military industrial complex that's been developing for decades to fight against the Soviet Union especially, why do we need it anymore? Now Russia is under really the thumb of the United States, under the control of the United States. It's very important to remember that there was really no peace dividend. That instead of a new era of peace, we got yet another era of war. And let's try to really think about this. Why do we have a new era of war? In 1992, as a few months after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a man named Paul Wolfowitz, who's working in the Bush administration's Defense Department at that time, he writes a document which has become known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And I want to read to you what it says. He's trying to lay out what will the US do now that the Soviet Union doesn't exist. He says, and this is a quote, "Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival. This is a dominant consideration in our new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would be sufficient to generate global power. These regions include Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East." I'll continue a little bit more. "First, the US must show the leadership necessary to establish and protect a new order that holds the promise of convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests." The document stressed that the whole world order would need to be, quote, "ultimately backed by the United States." Now, this is very interesting, and we should think about what this doctrine means. Colin Powell, who was also in the national security apparatus at that time, he says very famously, "I'm running out of villains. I'm left to only Fidel Castro and Kim Il-sung. I'm running out of villains," meaning we had a great military apparatus that was oriented towards defeating the Soviet Union and socialism. But now that we've won, how can we justify such a great military apparatus? A major element of this Wolfowitz doctrine, since there is no great enemy anymore, is to have such a projection of US military force around the world that no other capitalist country, including US allies, even considers, as they say, adopting a more aggressive posture. This ultimately is why NATO expands. It's not because Russia at that point was posing any threat to the United States, not at all. Russia in the 1990s was basically a neo-colony of the United States. But the US planners recognized, and they were right, that at some point Russia would come back on its feet. The Russian government would start to pursue its own national interests. And if NATO no longer existed, or if NATO were to include Russia, which actually Russia asked to join NATO at one point, if NATO were to include Russia, that this would develop a closer alliance between Western Europe and Russia inevitably, and a new world power essentially would have been created that would make the US military and financial power less relevant, less dominant. So a main aspect of the doctrine of the last 30 years has been to subordinate Europe, any potential capitalist rivals, to the United States. And NATO has been an extremely important part of that. You know, when a country joins NATO, it means they have to change a lot. They have to essentially change their military hardware, their infrastructure, and make it match whatever the US has. They become major purchasers of US weapons, and the US weapons contractors get enormous amounts of sums from this. It also means that US troops and bases start going into their countries. And as we all know, no country can really be free to pursue its own interests, its own independence, if it has foreign troops on its soil. So there's both a financial interest and a political interest in the expansion of instruments like NATO. And Vijay went through, there's many different instruments that the US has all over the world to make sure that this standing army, these bases are located all over the world to make sure that no one ever gets out of line. And that's ultimately what the new wave of wars is in the post-Soviet era. Wars against independent states or anyone who could get out of line. Afghanistan is not in the North Atlantic. Afghanistan was posing no great threat to the United States, nor was Iraq, nor was Libya, nor was Yugoslavia. These are not defensive wars. These are offensive wars in which the US shows the world that we will be the unrivaled and only military superpower. As Vijay went through in the first class, and I think it's worth going on watching these videos multiple times, this world order begins to suffer serious cracks with the Iraq War and with the world financial crisis of 2008. Countries like Russia and China start developing alternative economic arrangements. The Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, is a major one. This raises the question once again for the US, which I think we have to continuously highlight. And of course, I'm in the US, so I'm going to highlight it. But will a new competitor emerge? Given that the last 30 years have been demonstrations of force precisely to prevent the emergence of a new competitor. This was the established order as according to the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was really accepted by both parties, Republican and Democrat. When you look at it, Bill Clinton takes the Wolfowitz Doctrine and runs with it. He might not say it, but he basically does exactly that by expanding NATO. Barack Obama has critiques of George Bush and the Iraq War, and yet what he does in Libya is essentially the same thing. And the countries that George Bush puts on the quote axis of evil in 2001 and 2002, those are all the countries that have been targeted since by Democrats and Republicans: Iraq, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Libya, North Korea. These countries are targeted and named as such, named as targets in 2002, and the United States and both parties have spent the last 20 years targeting them. Now, in the last couple years, the US has shifted to a new era of major power conflict. This is the established geostrategic doctrine of the United States, major power conflict. It has been adopted with almost zero debate inside the United States. It raises the possibility, and in some ways the inevitability, of a major conflict that could lead to war with Russia or China or both of them together, essentially nuclear war. So that's the world that the US is intentionally constructing. And we can't see what's happened in Ukraine outside of this context as also preparing the ideological groundwork for a major power conflict with Russia and China. I want to close by just saying it's absolutely essential that we begin to raise a vision of a different world. What do the world's people have to gain from major power conflict? If 40 million people died in the First World War, 70 million people died in the Second World War, how many would die in the Third World War? It's essential at this moment that we fight the rush to war, that we fight the simplistic and sensational presentation, especially coming out of the media in the West that presents Russia as the great evil in the world and the United States as the great peacemakers. How could we leave it to the United States to be the so-called mediators of a conflict in Ukraine? The people who have withdrawn from nuclear treaties in 2017, they actually withdrew from a ban on intermediate range nuclear weapons. Donald Trump did this. The people who've put so many weapons into Ukraine in violation of the Minsk agreements of 2015 and 2016. the people who have actually refused to even consider that Russia might have some legitimate security interests. Russia said at the beginning, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, we want Ukraine as a neutral country like Switzerland or Austria, not in NATO, but doesn't have to be under a Russian sphere of influence, a neutral country. And we want security guarantees that there will not be advanced military systems placed in Ukraine, the country through which Russia was invaded in both world wars. And the United States ruled these out as non-starters. It's recently come to light in the Wall Street Journal that just 2 days before the invasion, the Prime Minister of Germany had arranged an agreement with Putin where if Ukraine pledged its non-aspirations to join NATO, that it would never join NATO, that basically a war could be avoided. And President Zelensky refused. By President Zelensky refusing, I have to believe, and I think many world observers believe, that the US refused it. That the US, in fact, is quite happy about this war, desired this war. That this war, for all of the crocodile tears they are now shedding, it serves their geostrategic purposes to turn the world against Russia, to turn Western Europe again into a neo-colony of the United States, to make sure it doesn't break free in terms of energy and military. This does not mean we support, or I support, or our party supports the decision to invade Ukraine. In fact, I believe in some ways, Russia has fallen into a trap by doing this. But we cannot forget who instigated and provoked this situation. We cannot forget who has waged war for the last 20, 30 years. We cannot forget, in fact, who has waged war against the global South for nearly a century. And we cannot make the greatest war makers into the greatest peacemakers. An alternative diplomacy is needed. We need ceasefire, of course, as an immediate step, but we need new security agreements that allows for a world in which all the countries' security interests, all the people's desire for peace can be respected. I believe that that is a vision ultimately that requires socialism, the poor and the working class being in power, because we don't desire the acquisition of markets or territories or trade routes. That's what the capitalists want, because they ultimately want profit. And a world not organized around profit, but on cooperation is possible, but it will take a lot of struggle and ultimately revolutionary transformation to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for grounding us in this very clear analysis of history and the current moment, which will help us begin to build a definition of peace that is truly in the interest of the working and the struggling people of the world. I want to pass it now to Dr. Aqil for his comments, and then we will open for questions.
Thank you. I would like first to thank you for this invitation, to give me this opportunity to have some comments about the issue. I am sure that in the past two lectures you talked a lot about NATO, but I want in brief to mention some remarks about NATO, and then about the relations between NATO and World Peace Council, where I am an active there, and then to pass to the situation in the Middle East and the role of NATO in the Middle East and perspectives of peace in the Middle East, if there is any now. We all know that NATO was established after the end of the Second World War, and the of Soviet Union in this war, and the elimination of Nazism from Europe, and the expansion of the socialist, so-called socialist bloc or community. United States, on the other side, came out from this war without serious losses, and even inaugurated this stage after the war by committing a major war crime using nuclear weapons against Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American imperialism aimed at two goals. The first attempt to prevent the spread of the victorious model in Europe after the war, and the second is to control Europe and the European and prevent any orientation towards an independent European policy on the one hand, and to prevent the establishment of friendly relations between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, especially with Russia and Soviet Union, in order to maintain Europe's independence on the United States and accept its leadership on the world after the Second War. It had become clear that NATO will be the tool that United States will use its dirty wars in all parts of the world, even in Europe itself. The bombing of Belgrade in 1999 was the clear evidence that NATO's aggression has no moral standards and has no limits, and that this alliance has never been a defense alliance since its founding, but rather a tool of aggression, occupation, and murder. Warsaw Treaty and Russian cooperation with Western Europe and the United States did not lead to the dissolution of this NATO after the dissolution of Warsaw Pact. Indeed, the bloodiest war in which NATO participated came after the collapse of Soviet Union and the dissolution of Warsaw Pact. As for the relations with the World Peace Council, with this alliance with NATO, it was no accident that the founding of the World Peace Council coincided with the founding of NATO. World Peace Council was established also 1949-51. The peace-loving people and peace-loving forces who realized that the extent of weapons and extent of the danger of the threat to world peace and the presence of nuclear weapons believed that it was necessary to establish a global front for the forces defending peace and to ward off the danger of war, recalling the tragic results of the two wars. As Comrade Ben said, in the Second War, there was more than 70 million people lost their lives. As for the relations with the World Peace Council, World Peace Council has, in all these years, from 1949 until now, some campaigns against NATO and against war. As you remember, World Peace Council had in European countries many times demonstrations and events against NATO summits in Lisbon, in Brussels, and World Peace Council also organized an international seminar or event against the foreign bases, knowing that there is hundreds of American and European bases all over the world, more than 800 bases all over the world. And because of that, this is the policy of World Peace Council against wars and against NATO, aiming to prevent a world peace and to achieve peace in many regions in the world where the American and European allies with NATO in the first place are committing war crimes and wars everywhere. For the purposes of United States imperialism during more than, if we want to talk about the situation in the Middle East and the role of NATO in the Middle East and in Palestine, for more than 100 years during the last century, from the beginning of the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian tragedy, they have always been supporters of aggression and occupation, denying the right of Palestinian people for self-determination. From the beginning, the British imperialism, which had the upper hand until the Second World War, was an ally of the Zionist movement and supporter of its colonial settlement policies in Palestine. Balfour Declaration, 1917, was nothing but the official declaration of this colonial policy. Zionism joined forces with the new leader of the world imperialism after the Second War, which is United States, without abandoning the old relations with other colonial powers, but rather added to it a new relations with Germany, taking advantage of the Nazi crimes against the Jews. The United States and its Western allies secured political, military, economical support and formed a diplomatic cover for the Israeli occupation in international forums and supported the settlement policy, land confiscation, and Israeli state terror against the Palestinian people and other Arab peoples. We know that Israel is occupying the whole territory of Palestine, sieging Gaza, occupying Syrian Golan Heights and Sheba farms from Lebanon. And in the war 1967, Israel occupied Sinai from Egypt. All these wars were with the support of NATO and United States and European countries. Although most of the Arab countries that were supported were supposed to constitute the base of the Palestinian struggle were now in allies with American policy in the region. The global imperialism and its American leadership have always been committed on the Israeli military superiority in comparison with countries of the region together. The US imperialism found itself in the attack of with the trade towers in New York 2001, taking advantage of the new global situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union to sit on the throne as the only pole and superpower to impose its control over the peoples of the world and to declare war on everyone who does not submit with its policies and recognition of its hegemony over the world under the slogan of war against terrorism. The invasion of Afghanistan was the first step. Then besieging and destroying and occupying Iraq, the American imperialism found in the protests of the Arab people against poverty, injustice, and corruption in what was known as the Arab Spring, found its opportunity to destroy the countries that refused to submit to the hegemony as the deal was made with the political Islam. Libya was the first victim of direct intervention and destruction. All NATO countries participated in bombing Libya and its destruction and regime change. Then intervention in Syria 2011 also began to change wanted to change the regime and to control the corridors and strike the alliance with Iran and the rest of the story you know. If we take a quick look at the situation in the region, we see that these countries need decades to compensate for the destruction left by the interventions of NATO and US imperialism. Tunisia is still suffering from instability and it is rising as well as Iraq. And the war on Yemen has entered its 8th year, and the war on Syria is not over yet. Iraq is experiencing a political crisis internally. It does not get out from of it due to external interventions. And as you know, Lebanon as a state is threatened with collapse. Morocco and Gulf states are deepening their alliances with Israel, with practices the same aggression policy. Although Israel is not a member of NATO, but its cooperation with NATO exists and is deep and deepens with the Turkish rotation and return to NATO, and many changes that the world may witness after the war in Ukraine. For all of the above, we see that the possibility of achieving peace in the region is very dark and very, very far away. And the results of the war in Ukraine may have far reaching effects on the region and prospect for stability in it, especially with the increasing importance of the presence of energy sources and huge gas reserves in it, which constitute a strategic weapon in the hands of those who will control it. But we see that despite the passage of more than 70 years since the end of the Second War, and in the emergence of Palestinian cause tragedy and the establishment of Israel and its occupation of the land of the Palestinian state and the lands of other Arab countries with the absolute power of global imperialism, especially the United States, and despite that war passed through multiple stages of Cold War, bipolarity and unipolar domination, but a just solution and peace did not happen, and the international community proved its inability to impose international law and respect its contents. But we are sure and we are confident that peoples of the region will continue their struggle despite the difficult conditions until peace is achieved, which will only be achieved by stopping imperialist interference in the people's affairs and returning rights to their owners, especially the Palestinian people, in ending the occupation and self-determination, achieving independence and the return of refugees and the release of prisoners. It is also necessary to solve all the outstanding internal issues from which the imperialist forces are running and exploiting them to achieve their interests, and on the expense of the peoples of the region, especially some problems with national or religious or sectarian issues. We believe that all the peoples of the region, especially Palestinian people, are willing to achieve peace. But if you now talk about peace to the Palestinians after all this behavior of imperialist countries and Israeli occupation, it seems to be strange for Palestinians now to talk about peace, especially with the Israeli regimes and Israeli political forces to move right and ultra-right, because we now have a government of settlers in Israel. Also, the United States, after more than 30 years of mediation, the so-called mediation between Palestinians and the Israelis after Oslo agreement, they didn't achieve anything, and they showed that they are not a mediator, but they are a supporter of occupation, especially in the last years when Donald Trump was president in the United States. He recognized Jerusalem as United Capital of Israel. He recognized the sovereignty of Israel on the Golan Heights. He closed the office of PLO in Washington, cut the aid to the Palestinian Authority. And after the change in the White House, Biden, who was talking about a new approach to the Palestinian issue and believing that that there will be a two-state solution after 1.5 years of his victory, and he came to the White House, he didn't take any step forward to the peace. In contrary, we know that United States is practicing the same policy they practiced after the Second War. We know that the siege and the sanctions against Iran. You know the history of the coup against Mossadegh in Iran. The Marines were in Lebanon, in Somalia. Occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a military bases in the Gulf countries, and now there is a presence of U.S. Army in Syria, using the Kurdish problem to divide Syria. And we believe that international solidarity with all these people can help to achieve some kind of stability and peace in the region. We believe that we want this war in Ukraine to stop, but also we understand the demands of all people around for their security and to be discussed and to be achieved by dialogue, not by, we believe that Russia was pushed this war, and as been said, the United States is very happy with this war. They are not losing anything. They are supporting Ukraine with weapons, but Ukrainian people who are dying, Ukrainian millions who are now refugees, and Ukrainian and Russian soldiers who are now who are killing, and because of that, NATO, European leaders, and United States very happy with this continuation of this war, as they were happy with the continuation of war in Yemen and in some other cases. I believe that with the support of all peace-loving people, if we unite, if we have a struggle against war, we can achieve a better future and a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akil, for your analysis and for bringing into sharper focus the conditions in the Arab and Maghreb region, especially in Palestine, which has been receiving some of the most concentrated attacks from the US imperialist forces for decades. And we can't understand what peace would look like without fully understanding the situation in the region. So now I would like to ask our tech to play some videos. We will go on a 5-minute break, during which time, please, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. After 5 minutes, we will come back and we will select questions to ask our speakers. During the break, we'll play 2 videos from media projects in the International People's Media Network. If you haven't subscribed to the projects in the Media Network, please do. It's a great source for up-to-date information on all of these issues, and we will put the links in the chat. So we will see you all again in 5 minutes.
Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, could soon be extradited to the United States to face charges that carry up to 175 years in prison. This ruling comes after a decade-long witch hunt of WikiLeaks and posed a threat to every single journalist in the world. How did this all start? WikiLeaks became a household name when a US Army intelligence analyst named Chelsea Manning leaked a video to WikiLeaks dubbed Collateral Murder. The video showed 2 US attack helicopter operators murdering 18 Iraqi civilians while callously laughing and enjoying the killing as it unfolded. Instead of trying the pilots for war crimes, the US Attorney General announced that they were investigating Assange for violating the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act of 1917 is a relic of World War I that says that the government is allowed to imprison anyone who publishes, quote, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of the US government. What's notable about this American law being used against Assange is that Assange has never even lived in the United States. He's Australian. Furthermore, nothing WikiLeaks has ever published has been shown to be false. So he's being charged for publishing truthful information. And finally, WikiLeaks didn't publish these leaks alone. They partnered with the New York Times, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel, yet none of these outlets have received the same treatment as WikiLeaks. This is why the charges against Assange are widely seen as fraudulent and his treatment inhumane. Numerous human rights organizations, lawyers, and even UN experts have called on the US Justice Department to drop the prosecution of Julian Assange entirely. Assange was being held in the UK, and the US has been trying to get the UK to extradite him to the US for years. Up until now, the UK courts held that the prison conditions in the US were so bad that there was a significant risk that Assange would commit suicide. Today, that ruling was overturned. If Assange is convicted, it would send a chilling message to investigative journalists around the world. Because what Assange did is what any investigative journalist does. Digs up information, documents, sources to reveal secrets in the interest of the public. This doesn't mean that if a New York Times reporter reveals a government secret, that what happened to Assange will happen to them. But it does mean that before a hard-hitting story even gets published, editors and lawyers will say, hey, remember what happened to Julian Assange? If we publish this story, that's what'll happen to you. It would also set a mind-boggling precedent where US censorship laws would effectively apply to publishers in other countries. This would essentially make any journalism in the world that criticizes US practices a punishable offense. Assange is being extradited to a country that has literally plotted to kill him, leaving no doubt that he won't get a fair trial. Yet at the still ongoing Summit for Democracy, the US is telling the world how it cares oh so much about press freedom. But the prosecution of Julian Assange shows what a bold-faced lie that really is.
23 de enero del año 2020, llegó el año 2020, con todos los retos y los desafíos. Mire esa marcha gigantesca, apenas está llegando al pueblo, pues. El pueblo de Caracas se lanzó a las calles hoy a decir victoria, victoria, victoria popular. Hace un año pretendieron imponerle a nuestro pueblo un golpe de Estado.
Months ago, they tried to impose our state, and the gringos said it was going to be quick and easy. Quick and easy? They do not count on the unity of our people. With the children of Chavez, we have taught them a lesson. We have taught a lesson to the United States imperialism and European imperialism. We have shown them that our people is not going to surrender. We'll keep on with the Bolivarian revolution. I want to send a message to the Yankee Empire. No pasarán. We are a rebel people. We are a people rebellion. We will give our lives to defend Bolivar's land. Nicolas Maduro has been legitimately elected. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. They want to invade Venezuela and Latin America. Put your hand on your heart. This is shameful. They will not do that. That is unjust. Venezuela is a free country, and so is Latin America.
All right, welcome back everybody, and thank you everyone for engaging and submitting your questions. We're going to start with two questions first. The first question is for Ben Becker, and it asks, as the cost of living is increasing at an unprecedented level, especially in the imperial core, how can this be used as a lever against military spending? How can we understand the fact that the alleged Progressive Democratic Party has consistently supported military spending over guaranteeing basic rights to the US population? And then for both speakers, after Ben, can you both speak to the hypocrisy of Biden recently calling for Putin to face an investigation or a trial for war crimes in Ukraine? Particularly, how can organizers today sharpen our interventions into the mainstream media hegemony and the momentum that it has at this time? I think, Ben, if you'd like to start, and then we can hear your thoughts as well, Dr. Ak.
Sure. Well, in the United States, we have to emphasize this has been an extremely terrible few years domestically in this country with the COVID pandemic. I mean, it's almost like it's old news now. And in fact, the COVID pandemic continues. I'm not sure what the current deaths are. It's well over 800,000 in the United States now. It's revealed so much about how this government functions, how it doesn't function, who it functions for. In the 2 years of the pandemic, though, just the super rich billionaires added, I think it was $2 trillion to their bottom line, to their wealth in those 2 years. It was the same amount of money that just the billionaires gained in new wealth during the pandemic. Incredible to think of the amount of wealth that was made during a time of such human suffering and misery, when people were left without health care, without housing, or were put on the streets after a temporary suspension in evictions, with low wages, didn't have protective equipment. How many inequalities just got sharpened in the last 2 years? And this government had a purely dysfunctional response, fighting amongst itself. Local, state, and federal authorities couldn't do the most basic things. And yet the rich got so much richer than they've ever been before. The amount that the billionaires added to their wealth in those 2 years could have been spent. It was the same amount that was needed for a bill that was put forward called the Build Back Better bill, which was Joe Biden's domestic agenda. It included infrastructure. It included climate change adaptation, mitigation efforts. It included parental leave, family leave, sick leave. These are things that are still not rights for workers in the United States. Universal childcare, which is also not a right here. It included the idea that the very radical idea that senior citizens in this country would have access to hearing aids and dental care, also not a right and not covered in the country's healthcare system for the elderly, which is called Medicare. These were very modest proposals to finally learn from the pandemic and do something for the working class. And the bill failed. And they said it was too expensive. And even a few Democrats, they're the ones who really sabotaged the bill and ended it. Technically, But even the other Democrats who said they were for it, there was no great crusade or fight to oust or out or pressure their Democratic colleagues, or the Republicans for that matter, who also opposed the bill. And so 2 years later, nothing has changed in the US economic system. There has not been one single reform that has been passed. And it's like we're going into elections again this year, and those issues are not on the table. Instead, everyone is talking about Ukraine and critical race theory, which is a whole other thing, all these distractions. But the real fundamental issues that the working class are facing have been neglected, and the Democrats have decided they're not really going to fight for it. The Democrats control the White House and both chambers of the legislature. So I think it's a fundamental thing that we raise, as you say, how $1 trillion per year is going to the military, and then another really $1 trillion a year is being siphoned, being sucked by the billionaires for their to become even more wealthy. Every year, this is the value that is being produced, that is being handed over either to the government in the form of taxes or handed over to capitalist owners that produces nothing of value for the working class. All these F-35 jets and tanks and bombs, you can't eat those. You can't take shelter in those. All the things that people need could be used instead. What the big military contractors have done, which is very important to emphasize with the Pentagon, the F-35 the Air Force system, the fighter jets, which are completely ridiculous technology and they cost billions of dollars per plane. They've made it so that these are constructed in 48 out of 50 states play some role in the construction of the F-35 fighter jet system. I just want to highlight this. They did this intentionally because they wanted, if anyone said, we don't need these F-35 fighter jets anymore, they do nothing for humanity, then the military contractors could fund political campaigns against that congressperson and said, you're killing jobs in your state. So by distributing the jobs made for military production to all the states in the country, they make it impossible for the legislature, who are supposed to represent the people, to actually say, this is insanity, this is an absurdity. And so they all live in fear of the military industrial lobby in the United States. So we have to take aim at the military industrial lobby, which is giving millions and millions of dollars to both Democrats and Republicans.
Thank you very much, Ben. Dr. Akif?
Yes, thank you. I think that hypocrisy and double standard is a usual policy we saw from the Western countries. As you know, now they are showing us massacres in Bucha in Ukraine as a war crime, and Putin has to stop or not be able to continue as a president of Russia because of the war on Ukraine. I don't believe that people forgot the pictures from Iraq, the pictures from Abu Ghraib prison, where the American soldiers shot themselves to torture the Iraqi people and the Iraqi soldiers. Siege of Iraq killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children because the sanctions and the food and the milk to come to Iraq, and then destroyed the Iraq. And this Western media, and they didn't say anything. Also, the siege of Gaza, which is continuing now for 15 years, and Israeli wars against Gaza. Nobody of these countries demand the stopping of Israeli aggression against Palestinians and against Gaza, but they are all every day demanding and condemning any action against Israel. Unfortunately, the United Nations now is unable to do anything for any people who are suffering from. You can see how they are dealing with the issue of refugees, the discrimination between refugees. First of all, the correspondents on the TV said that these refugees from Ukraine are with blue eyes, white skins, and they looks like Europeans. They are not. They don't look like Syrians or Iraqi or Afghan refugees. This is a double standard. This is an hypocrisy. This is the racism which occurs, and because of that, we believe that the media is committing also war crimes side by side with the world imperialism in all over the world. They didn't condemn any aggression against people if the aggressor is in line with the United States and with NATO and with European countries. But any people, as in Venezuela or in Palestine or in Nicaragua or in Cuba, they are committing crimes against these people because the revolutionary people there are not willing to comply with demands of world imperialism, with United States policy and demands. Thank you.
I mean, I just wanted to say one thing about other sort of practical things we can do. And for our part, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, has been producing mass literature about, with the title, Why We Should Oppose a No-Fly Zone. And we've been going into working class communities all over the country and going door to door with them. This brochure, this is the old grassroots style of campaigning that I think is necessary in this moment where the mainstream media is almost entirely controlled by a single narrative. We have to be out in our communities talking to people about what the implications of a no-fly zone, for instance, would be. What are the implications of this $1 trillion in spending? And I'll just add one thing about the tribunal concept and the trying of Putin or others for war crimes. In addition to what Dr. Akel mentioned about the great hypocrisy and the fact that the United States no one's been held to account, for instance, for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani a few years ago. That's just a completely unpunished crime, a violation of all international law. The US assassinated the leading general of a sovereign country. I mean, incredible to think about. And nothing happened. What's going on in Yemen, what's going on in so many other places. There was actually, and almost all of these international courts are just used as kangaroo courts to target whoever the United States wants to target. The whole concept of a court has to be equality before the law. If you have a court that only prosecutes some and only finds some guilty, that's not a real court. It's just another media construction used for a political narrative. If we want to have courts, they have to be depoliticized courts with equality about who's going to be held to account. No one in the United States has been held to account for the war in Iraq, the greatest war crime of the modern era. All the people who ordered those atrocities, not a single person spent a day in jail. In fact, the United States will not, the reason they finally left Iraq, if you really remember the details in what was called the Status of Forces Agreement, is that the Iraqi government, which was not the most nationalistic anti-US government, said crimes committed by US soldiers on Iraqi soil, they will start to be, they'll have to go under Iraqi law and be tried in Iraqi courts. And the US made this such a non-negotiable demand that they said, we will pull out all of our troops before we let a single US soldier be held to account in an Iraqi legal system for war crimes or for other crimes. This is how dedicated the United States is to a one-sided world order, where they can decide who can do what and who will be tried for what and who will become the great villains and who will be cast as the great knights. One other piece of information, in 1986, the International Court of Justice found the United States to be guilty of violating international law with its intervention in the country of Nicaragua. By funding the Contras and funding the Contra wars, they had committed a great international crime. The US said it was a member of the International Court of Justice. They were found guilty. They were told to pay reparations. And instead of doing that, they just said, we're not going to pay a dime. You're not going to do anything about it. Who's going to make us pay? And they just refused to observe the judgment. So that's an example of what how this government really treats the concept of international law. It's full of international war criminals, and it has no intention of ever observing the high-minded words that they use from time to time when it comes to targeting some other country.
Thank you very much to both of you. I have one more round of 2 questions. The first is specifically for Dr. Akil. How do you see the impact of the recent US brokered Abraham Accords on peace in the region? How has this impacted, for example, the conflicts and wars in Yemen, Western Sahara, and Palestine, and the aggression against different countries in the region? And then the second question for both of you. It's clear that for a real situation of peace, we need to change our economic system and abolish capitalism. But at the moment, that's not so easy, and we have to find some middle-term solutions. For example, is asking our different governments to get out of NATO a possible and understandable claim? Or, for example, the NATO summit is coming up in June in Madrid. How could we show unity and reject the NATO countries as they present themselves as peacemakers? I'll start with Dr. Akil.
Thank you. First of all, we believe here in the Middle East, and I think that every logic man or human being cannot believe that some agreement between Israel and Bahrain, for example, or with the United Arab Emirates or with any other Arab country can help to achieve peace in the Middle East without dealing with the core issue, which is the Palestinian issue. We believe that these Abraham agreements have nothing to do with peace. They are trying to create a new pact or a new coalition against Iran, because some Gulf countries believe that if Iran will have nuclear weapon, or if Iran will have missiles or something, Iran will threaten their countries. On the other side, Iran is claiming every day a negotiation with neighboring countries to achieve peace in the region and to have normal relations. But the United States and Israel are pushing them to have a new pact in the Middle East. With Morocco, the situation is something different, because in the agreement between Morocco and Israel, the United States recognized the sovereignty of Morocco upon Sahara. It is known that this was a deal. You will have relations with Israel and we will recognize Sahara as a part of Morocco. This is not a new effort from the side of the United States and NATO, because as you remember, 1955, 56, 57, there was an effort to create Baghdad Pact, or some kind of NATO in the Middle East. A branch of NATO in the Middle East was always in the agenda of the United States. and through that, the coup against Mossadegh in Iran was something like in the road to do that. U.S. policy and the aggression against Egypt, 56 with Britain, France, and Israel to attack Egypt. All this, and as you remember, latest United States forced Sudan to have relations with Israel, to take Sudan from the blacklist or from the sanctions. And because of that, we believe that there is no efforts for peace. It is a new order which the United States and allies are trying to create in the Middle East against the peoples of the Middle East, not for the peace and for the future of the peoples of the Middle East. Because we believe, and all here believe, that without achieving peace between Israel and Palestinian people, peace will not be created in the Middle East. And to go to the second question, we in the World Peace Council discussed these issues always when there was a summit of NATO. Many organizations of World Peace Council in European countries especially, and US Peace Council, always demanding the solution of NATO and the withdrawal from their countries from NATO, Portugal, Greek, Britain, France, and United States. The withdrawal from NATO is not easy because a coalition and there is a common interest between the imperialist forces in these countries, the capitalist forces in these countries. But with a mass struggle on the streets, and with changing policies and putting pressure on governments, we believe that something can be achieved. But it needs a struggle and unity of all forces who have the same goals to fight together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Akel. I think that was beautifully said, and I totally agree with you. Ultimately, the solution has to come from pressure from below. I think the speaker is correct, or the question was correct, that we have to figure out short-term and medium-term solutions or steps forward, even short of a total change of the economic system. And I am in agreement that NATO and these instruments of global power projection, these instruments of global violence, we have to demand that the countries that are a part of them withdraw, that they're only set up to wage war. They say they're defensive, they say they're going to protect people, but basically what NATO means for the other peoples of Europe is that if there's any conflict, all of them will be drawn into it. All of them will be targeted. And so it's if you're in Greece or Germany or France or Italy, you know, we need to change we don't want a new Cold War. A new Cold War would just be a prelude to a new hot war. So I think that's one thing. Another thing we have to emphasize to people, and this is not just to working class people, but to the whole population. And you would think even some capitalists would be able to recognize that the threat of climate change is an existential threat to the whole entire world. The International Panel on Climate Change released a report this week that says we have to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by the end of this decade. And right now we're on track to only reduce by 2 or 3%. And instead of having this conversation, and by the way, if the temperatures rise by 3 degrees by 2100, which is what we're on track for, this will mean the extinction of 1/3 of the species on the planet. So this is an urgent need thing that requires global cooperation. And instead of having the great industrial and technological powers come together and say, how can we solve this problem? Which is what's needed. The United States and China and Russia, all of these countries which need to be working together, instead are gearing up for another round of war. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. So we have to make a case for peace That's not just that we don't like war, but this is an urgent necessity that there be global cooperation. And I think it's going to be hard for some of us in a country like the United States. If you say you're for peace with Russia or China, you get labeled an agent and you get labeled a spy, and your YouTube channels get shut down. And it's very hard to speak in this moment. In other countries, it might be easier to make this case and to make it more firmly and publicly. But this is a thing that all of us around the world have to work on together. And the countries of the global South that are saying they want a multipolar world, they want relations with China and Russia, they're not going to be intimidated into breaking relations. This is also, I think, a very important step. It doesn't mean that it will ensure global peace, but it makes it harder for the US to just do whatever it wants, to just cripple and destroy nations as it chooses. So I think each of us in our different parts of the world, we have different tasks, but ultimately they're complementary tasks to ensure a world of peace finally.
Thank you both. We are coming near to the end of the session, so I wanted to open the floor to see if either of you have any final closing comments or anything you would like to add to what you've already contributed. I could start with Dr. Akid.
Thank you. When we talk about double standards, it came to mind, can you imagine if one Russian bomb killed Zelensky? You can compare it with the pictures from Libya when the NATO bombs killed Gaddafi in brutal way, when they killed Saddam Hussein in another brutal way. It doesn't matter if we agree with Gaddafi or with Saddam Hussein, but this double standard with the Western countries, with NATO countries, to deal with these issues with this way, it is from itself a war crime. I believe that after this war in Ukraine and after this jump of prices and life cost everywhere, and if the energy crisis become a real crisis, if Russia reached to a point to cut gas to Europe and to some other countries, I believe that then the world will be in a very, very crucial situation. And because of that, we believe that all of us to fight against wars, against NATO, and for world peace. Every one of us has to take his responsibility anywhere in the world, and the effect will be in the end. People all over the world have nothing to do with wars. They need peace and they want peace. Nobody wants war, and because of that, we hope and we believe and we will do what we in our power to work to struggle for world peace. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to remind ourselves, and because this is a challenging moment, this is a very hard moment for the world left and progressive movement. There's no doubt about it. But the world has seen many dark moments before, and sometimes even dark moments can become the triggers for revolutionary moments not that long after. And we can imagine that in 1914, how the world left, for instance, the working class movement felt to see all of the parties that said they were for peace signing up for wars against one another. And that was a much more catastrophic war than what's happening right now. And this is bad too. And you saw many people who had said they were for peace sign up for war. And now we even see moments like this where people who say they're against NATO Now some of them are for NATO, or they're silent about NATO. And there's a lot of pressure to give up our principles. And there's a lot of pressure to accept some of the war makers' logic and the logic of NATO. And it doesn't matter if we have to go through a period of some isolation in some of our countries, not all of them. If we have to go through a period of isolation politically, it will make us stronger and we will be vindicated. The people who are against NATO now and who stand on their principles, who say what we've been saying for decades, they will be vindicated because NATO will only lead to more war and the people want peace. And that contradiction will lead people back to those who have been advocating for peace all along. And that is what the point of an instrument like the International People's Assembly is all for. And all throughout history, the working class has tried to create political instruments that articulate their interests not from the standpoint of one nation, but from all the nations, an internationalist viewpoint. And so the IPA, what we're doing here today is vitally important, that we have to be able to articulate another vision for the world. And it doesn't matter if we're huge at this moment, because ultimately our vision corresponds with the yearnings of the vast majority. And it's really the job of organizing to put those two things together. And if I can plug one thing, we have to keep studying. The book that I mentioned in the beginning, Imperialism in the 21st Century, we have to keep studying and studying and studying, because ultimately, even if we can't stop every war, by us understanding how the system works, we're equipping ourselves to stop the next war. So thank you again. It's been an honor to join you all today.
I want to say a very big thank you to both of our speakers today, Ben Becker and Dr. Akiltakis, for joining us and for sharing your wonderful contributions and your analysis, and for being with us in this closing session. Thank you also to all of our interpreters, without whom we would not all be able to participate. Your work has been essential for this course. And most importantly, a very, very big thank you to all of you who have joined us in this program. We know, all of us, like Ben just said, as people in struggle against imperialism, we must study, we must approach every new challenge with a clear and concrete understanding. And this requires us to be studying together, to investigate, to debate and exchange our experiences across the different contexts. So thank you everybody for being with us in this process. As one participant said earlier in the chat, we are in a process of fighting for human survival. And so it gives us a great optimism to know that we're connected with people across the world and that we are not alone in this struggle against imperialism. So thank you, everybody. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the International People's Assembly social media and YouTube channels. You can revisit this class and see the past classes there as well as many upcoming programs that I'm sure we will let you all know about. Please stay in touch with us and keep us updated on your struggle and on your actions. Thank you all very much, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.